Welcome everybody around the world. Welcome to all my subscribers. So I have one of a few videos I've been planning to make lately. I'll get this one out of the way tonight. Now, I want to try and make my videos shorter, so I'm going to aim for under half an hour here. I have a fair little bit of stuff to read, but nonetheless, I'll plow it very quickly. So, many rabbis out there today, well, pretty much every single rabbi out there today, every Jewish rabbi, of course, denies that Jesus is the Messiah, of course. One of the main reasons, which will be basically the main focus of this video here, one of the main reasons that they deny Jesus could be the Messiah is because they died. And they say that there's no reason to think that Messiah would die according to the Tanakh. Okay, now every Christian out there will say, oh, well, it did tell us that this would take place. It told us in Daniel chapter 9 and of course the famous Isaiah 53. And Judaism strongly denies that these two chapters are about the Messiah, and they say that it's absolutely impossible because, in their belief, since those chapters aren't about Messiah, it therefore means that Tanakh does not give us any clue that the Messiah would suffer or die. Therefore, Jesus must be a lie. This is their way of thinking. But I have to say, and I'm not the only person to say this, many people have long said, and the rabbis are familiar with this, that this is the claim from Christians, that it was around the 15 or 1600s or somewhere around there that the opinion in Judaism changed. What I mean is that up until then, the vast majority in Judaism believed that the Messiah would come twice. The first time he would suffer and die, but the second time he would be the great immortal, Ben David figure. So this is also tied into Messiah coming twice, which is another major issue because they say likewise, there's no mention of Messiah coming twice. But Messiah dying and coming twice are directly related. So anyways, right, so they're both relevant, so I'll just mention both. But by showing that Messiah would die, it also enhances that there must be two, advents of Messiah, because if it's the same one figure, he's obviously not going to die on the second visit. He would have to die on the first visit, and it's including one of which in which he died. So they do go right in hand. So, anyways, if you ask any rabbi today, like Tavia Singer or any of the other famous rabbis, they would say that, Judaism did not believe that, Isaiah 53 was about Messiah. If you asked any opinion today, they would say that, oh no, Judaism never believed that. It's a Christian lie to say that the opinion of Judaism changed. Okay? But the reality is, I have a mountain of evidence here to show that Judaism did teach, okay, that the rabbis, some of the most prominent, famous rabbis of their time, all held that the Messiah would suffer and die. Which in hand, like I said, shows that there must be two advents of the Messiah. Because he doesn't come, suffer, and die, and that's it. That was Messiah. No. The whole big deal of Messiah is that he comes and there's an eternal kingdom of peace. Okay? However, Judaism and Christianity have long held that the Tanakh does reveal that Messiah, for whatever reason, would suffer and die in what could only be the first of two visits. Okay? For example, Daniel 7 talks about the final visit, which would be, to Judaism, would be the one and only visit, but to Christians it's the second visit. The Ben David immortal type figure who comes to gain and get dominion and glory and all that there, right? Maybe not glory, but dominion and all that. Obedience of peoples. Okay, but it's that first visit where, if Jesus was the Messiah, it's that first visit, when he was here as Jesus. What's the deal with him suffering and dying? So what does the Tanakh actually say? It would be a separate video to go through Isaiah 53, and I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to read Jewish sources, rabbinical quotes from Jewish texts and everything. I have a nice mountain of evidence here that I'm going to read through. I'm not going to get into Isaiah 53 and all of that because that's a whole other half an hour of argument. Right? And at the end of the day, we could argue for another 2,000 years on what Isaiah 53 is about. It's either A or B. I mean, it's either about the Messiah or it's not about the Messiah. If it's not about the Messiah, it's probably about Israel. So, and then we could have another third argument about Daniel chapter 9, and that's a separate argument. And again, it could go on for another 2,000 years. So I'm just going to go look at these Jewish sources and see what Judaism and the rabbis of Judaism did believe historically, okay? And you will see that it is nothing but a blatant lie from many modern rabbis, and I won't name names, but when they claim, to each their own, that Judaism didn't change the wheel, they've always believed the same thing, all right? I will show you that that is a lie, okay? Judaism and the rabbis did believe the Messiah will come first, suffer and die, and obviously come again in great glory. Okay? Yin and yang, complete opposites. Okay, I'll show that. But before I do that, to get this out of the way first, because it's very quick and easy, if you go to Jews for Judaism's website, they have a page titled, "It's True That Jews Interpreted Isaiah 53 as Referring to the Messiah Before Rashi." Okay? I can't remember exactly when Rashi was, maybe 15 or 1600s. Okay, so they actually have an article on this. And to save people's time, I've read the article. It's only about a page long. They only give one reference. Their only reference to back up their big claim here is a reference from the church father Origen. Okay? So, actually, no, I'll just read the whole thing. It says, "Is it true that Jews interpreted Isaiah 53 as referring to the Messiah until the medieval commentator Rashi explained it as referring to the people of Israel? Let's find out." Answer. Okay, so consider this is Jews for Judaism. Very proud anti-missionary organization, pro-Judaism, anti-missionary. They're obviously against Christianity, right? But I'm not trying to demonize them. But they're a powerhouse when it comes to anti-missionary efforts. So this is their own website, and they had all the opportunity to provide tons of evidence. This is a very important topic. The argument of Judaism today is that Jesus and Christianity are wrong because the Bible does not say Messiah would die. This is a very important issue, because if the Bible does say the Messiah would die, then that points to Christianity. But if it doesn't, then that would point away from Christianity, right? So let's not listen to me from nowadays. Let's not listen to the rabbis from nowadays, like Tovia Singer and everybody else out there. Let's not listen to us. Let's listen to these ancient voices, right? That's the purpose of my video here. But so Jews for Judaism had a poignant opportunity on their own website to give a good body of evidence to back up their very title, which is it true that Jews interpreted Isaiah 53 as referring to the Messiah before Rashi? I mean, yes, it is. I mean, the short answer is, yeah, it is true. They did. But would they admit that on this website? Of course not. Okay? Of course not. But their only evidence to back up their claim is one measly little reference, which is to the church father Origen. Origen wrote a lot of books, but they never made it into the New Testament. Okay, so Origen is, in that sense, a nobody. Who really cares? I mean, no Christian, like the average Christian, will not read the books of Origen. Okay, probably even back in his day. Maybe he was a little more popular back then, but it's not like Origen's writings are scripture. It's not like anybody, therefore, really cared about his opinion on things. Okay, except for his own circle of people back then. So just consider that this is the great answer to their own dedicated page on their website. It says the answer: Christian missionaries claim that it is only with the commentary of Rashi from 1040 to 1105 seeking to refute the Christian interpretation of Isaiah 53, that the Jews began to refer to Isaiah 52 and 53 to the entire nation of Israel. This misconception, they said, perhaps owes its origin to Edward Pusey, who wrote in his 1876 introduction to the suffering servant of Isaiah to the Jewish interpretations, that the new interpretation, quote, began with Rashi. So what they're trying to do here is pin it all to a recent book. And I've seen, rabbis and others make attempts like this before to belittle or to make Christians look ignorant, right? They refer to a book that was written recently and they say, oh, well, Christians are getting all their silly ideas from these crazy books that were written like 100 years ago, right? But this is what they say. They say that Edward wrote this book in 1876 where he said the new interpretation began with Rashi. So, end quote. The interpretation, this is Jews for Judaism narration continuing. The interpretation was neither new nor began with Rashi. This missionary allegation was refuted even by a Christian source. In Contra Celsum, written in 248 CE, some 800 years before Rashi, but also over about 220 years after Jesus, by the way, it said the church father Origen reports that Jews contemporary with him interpreted this passage, meaning chapter 52 and 53, as referring to the entire nation of Israel. Okay? He wrote, quote, I remember that once in a discussion with some whom the Jews regarded as learned, I used these prophecies, Isaiah 52 and 53. At this, the Jews said that these prophecies referred to the whole people of Israel as though a single individual. Excuse me, since they were scattered in the dispersion and smitten, that as a result of the scattering of the Jews among the other nations, that they might become proselytes. In this way he explained the text, quote, thy form shall be glorious among men, end quote, and, quote, those to whom he was not proclaimed shall see him, end quote, and being a calamity. And that's the end of their origin reference. And they wrap up their page entry on this article by saying this shows that Jewish biblical exegesis, I don't know how to say that word properly, subscribing to the belief that the people of Israel was the suffering servant spoken of throughout the entire passage, predates Raw many centuries. So basically what they're saying is that, oh, we have this reference that Origen said something in 250 AD, okay? And this from Origen proves that Jews, the rabbis, and all of Judaism as a collective, that we all just believed that the chapters are about Israel, right? And that's it for their page entry on this article, right? So they're the ones who created a web page on their website asking the great question, the 2,000-year-old question, is it true that Jews interpreted Isaiah 53 as referring to the Messiah or not? And their answer is, oh, of course, we never believed that it was about the Messiah, right? And their only evidence was one quote from Origen. Origen's a nobody. I'm sorry, but he's a nobody. Like, people don't refer to things that Herodotus wrote. People don't refer to things that Josephus wrote because they're not to that level, of historically trustworthy. They're not to the level of scripturally trustworthy, right? So, but anyways, that's all their evidence. And what's even more insulting, I think, to their claim is that this quote is really basically like, oh, I was at the library one day and I was sitting next to somebody and he seemed like a pretty smart Jewish guy, and the Jewish guy said, oh yeah, we believe it's Israel. I mean, that's the essence of what the quote is. It says, I remember that once in a discussion with some whom the Jews regard as learned, I used these prophecies. At this, the Jews said that these prophecies referred to Israel. Like, that's literally like a story, like, oh, I met this guy at a library and he happened to mention, oh yeah, I am, or I know some really smart Jewish guys, and they think it's Israel. Like, that's the evidence that Jews for Judaism has presented here on their own website. So I just want everybody to see that first, okay? Now, I'm going to present my evidence, right? Now, I will prove that Judaism, the rabbis, and the Jews did believe that these things were about Messiah. And also because it just popped back into my head. I had a little epiphany yesterday, and I realized that, we're also used to hearing the rabbis and, like, to be a singer, where they teach and they say, like, oh, when you read the New Testament, it's got so many you know, it's so askew from the Tanakh, and it's contradicts things, and they always portray and demonize the New Testament as being absolutely bogus nonsense, right? And where was I getting to with this again? Oh, that's right. Yeah. But what these rabbis don't understand is that the disciples of Jesus were all Jewish. Okay, Jesus was Jewish, the disciples were all Jewish, even the early apostles were Jewish. Okay, and they kept the laws of Judaism. They didn't follow this new religion where they threw everything away. It was only when they spoke to Gentiles, and you can read Acts 15, Acts 21 for proof of this, where when they taught the Gentiles to come to God, they taught the Gentiles that they don't have a law, right? But the Jews always kept their law. The disciples, the apostles did. If you read the New Testament, you can see that for yourself, right? So that's fact number one. But Judaism, the rabbis always say, oh, the New Testament's bogus nonsense. Christians and Jesus just tried to make up this new religion where you worship some crazy guy as God. And, they're all deluded. It's like a cult. This is essentially what they say. Um, because when you read the New Testament, there are many references to Isaiah 53. Like there are quotes and references made. Now the rabbis would say, "Oh, that's just because it's all bogus nonsense." Isaiah 53 was never about the Messiah, but the New Testament has many places where it quotes, Isaiah, and in reference to Jesus' crucifixion and such, fulfilling prophecy and everything, right? But Judaism says, "Oh, well, that's how crazy Christianity is because the Tanakh doesn't even say Messiah would die." You see my point? I didn't word it very eloquently, but I think I conveyed my point now, right? But the reality that they don't understand to start with is that Christianity was not a new religion. It was literally Judaism for Jews and Gentile law for Gentiles. Read Acts 15, Acts 21. They don't understand that to start with, right? But the next thing is the reason why the New Testament makes these references to Isaiah and such, in relation to the Messiah dying. The reason they make those references is not because the ancient Christians who wrote those books are crazy. It's because they were and Jews and many and thousands of Jews, and it was a growing number at the time, believed Jesus. And because they believed it and they applied their scriptural wisdom and analysis, being rabbis and such, to the text, they realized, wow, yeah, in Isaiah 53, we look at Jesus, it makes perfect sense. Okay? This also shows the fact that it's recorded in the New Testament, references like this show that it was a commonly held belief at the time. So it wasn't a new thing. It wasn't like when Jesus showed up, all the rabbis and the Jews realized, hey, this sounds like Isaiah 53. And that was the first time they conceived of Isaiah 53 being about the Messiah. No, what we understand is that there had been a long, anciently held belief based on Isaiah, which was written in like 800 to 500 BC. Okay, there had been a long held belief about 1,000 years before then that the Messiah would suffer and die. Okay, and the things I'm going to read evidence that. And also, like I said, the reality that the New Testament, they're referencing the Tanakh verses about this because that was a held belief at the time that the Messiah would suffer and die. I mean, if it wasn't, how could they you have to understand this, right? The Christian imperative is to go to the entire world. Yes, to get the 60 million Jews or whatever to also follow Jesus, but there's 7.5 billion others on the planet. And the Christian imperative is to spread the gospel to everybody, to even risk your life and limb to spread the good news of God and Jesus and all that to the entire world, right? So that is like a big bulk of everything. 60 million versus 7.5 billion people. Okay? Now, those 7.5 billion people were pagans back then. They didn't know about the Bible, God, they didn't know anything about that. So if you're going, like Judaism claims Christianity was this invention, like a cult invention. If you're inventing a new cult, then, and your modus operandi is to take it to the entire world and risk your life to do so, Why would you have to style that invented religion after a currently existing one? You could just make anything up. Why go through that effort? Why argue and have all these arguments? It's just not logical or plausible. It would make no sense going from one nation to the next across the planet. These nations don't know each other. It's not like they had airplanes and telephones. The people on the boats, there were very few people crossing oceans on boats back then. But these people who were doing that and traveling around, they spread Christianity. Okay? And why did they do that? Because it wasn't an invented religion. They believed it to be real. They knew it to be real. They accepted it or took it or believed it to be real, to each their own degree. Okay? That's why. It's not because it was some big conspiracy to break down Judaism. You know what I mean? This is ridiculous. Okay? But anyways, so the reality, like we'll see right now, is that Judaism has always believed that the Messiah would suffer and die, meaning that he would actually come twice. Okay? So, in no specific order, some of these are from more prominent rabbis like Maimonides, some of these are from actual Jewish texts, but teacher, and some of these are lesser known rabbis, but I will read every single one, and this is actually a small selection. There's a lot more evidence out there, right? After the first few, you will understand that, this is overwhelming evidence. Clearly, like I claimed, Judaism believed, the rabbis, the religion, Judaism, the people, the Jews, they believed that the Messiah would suffer and die. And evidently, this changed at some point, because in the modern day, if you asked 99.9% of Jewish people, they would say, oh no, Messiah would never suffer or die. So something changed along the line. It's indeniable, right? So anyways, we start off from 1508. We have born in 1508, Rabbi Moses Al-Shek. And when he referred to Isaiah 53, he said, our rabbis with one voice accept and affirm the opinion that the prophet is speaking of the Messiah, and we shall ourselves also adhere to the same view. So this rabbi has said that our rabbis with one voice accept that it's about the Messiah. Okay? Funny they didn't mention that on Jews for Judaism. But they felt that Origen, who's essentially a nobody, was so important that they would mention that. But they'll just leave at this. But there's many more. From Cornell, from 1437, 1508, he said, this is also the opinion of our own learned men in the majority of their midrashim. Okay, that it's about Messiah. Now, he also said, the first question is to ascertain of whom this refers. For the learned among the Nazarenes expound it of the man who was crucified in Jerusalem at the end of the Second Temple. Yohanan ben Uziel interpreted it in the Targum of the future Messiah, but this is also the opinion of the learned men in the majority of the Midrashim. Then we have Rabbi Yafeth ben Ali from the second half of the 10th century, who said, as for myself, I am inclined to regard Isaiah 52 and 53 as alluding to the Messiah. Abraham Farasol from 1451-1526 said, in this chapter there seem to be considerable resemblances and allusions to the work of the Christian Messiah and to the events which are asserted to have happened to him, so that no other prophecy is to be found the gist and subject of which can be so immediately applied to him. From the Targum Jonathan in the 4th century, it gives the introduction on Isaiah 52:13 as, quote, behold, my servant the Messiah shall prosper. He shall be high and increase and be exceedingly strong, end quote. From Gersonides in 1288-1344, he says on Deuteronomy 18:18, quote, in fact, Messiah is such a prophet as it is stated in the Midrash on the verse, behold, my servant shall prosper, which is a reference to Isaiah 52, which subsequently shows that my servant is about Messiah. Then, from the Midrash Tanhuma, it says, quote, he was more exalted, the Messiah, than Abraham, more extolled than Moses, higher than the archangels. This is their reference to Isaiah 52, verse 13. Okay, from Yalkut Shamion, ascribed to Rabbi Simeon Kara in the 12th century. In his commentary on Zechariah 4:7, he says, quote, "He, the King Messiah, is greater than the patriarchs, as it is said, my servant shall be high and lifted up and lofty exceedingly," which is a reference to Isaiah 52. The great Maimonides, who was from 1135 to 1204, wrote to Rabbi Jacob Al-Fajumi and said, quote, "Likewise said Isaiah that he, the Messiah, would appear without acknowledging father or mother. He grew up before him as a tender plant and as a root out of the dry ground." This is a direct reference to Isaiah 53, showing that even Maimonides believed that it's about Messiah. From the Tanchuma it says, quote, "Rabbi Nachman says, the word man in the passage, every man ahead of the house of his father, in Numbers 1:4, refers to the Messiah, the son of David, as it is written, behold the man, whose name is Zamach, the branch," where Jonathan interprets, quote, "Behold the man Messiah," Zechariah 6:12, and so it is said, a man of pains and known to sickness, which is a direct reference to Isaiah 53. All that fancy talk says Messiah would suffer, okay? And in hand shows that he would die. Isaiah 53 says he was cut off from the land of the living, which never happened to Israel, to Israel, by the way. Next, from the great Talmud, it says, Talmud Sanhedrin in 98b, and I've read it there myself, quote, "Messiah, what is his name?" The rabbis say, "The leprous one," which means the sick one or the afflicted one. "Those of the house of the rabbi. For it says, surely he has borne our sicknesses," which is a direct reference to Isaiah 53, verse 4. Then from the Pesikta Rabbati, which is around 845 AD, on Isaiah 61, verse 10, it says, quote, "The world fathers," meaning patriarchs, "will one day in the month of Nisan arise and say to the Messiah, Ephraim, our righteous, anointed, although we are your grandparents, yet you are greater than we, for you have borne the sins of our children," as it says, quote, "But surely he has borne our sicknesses and carried our pains. Yet we did not esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced because of our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was laid upon him, and through his wounds we are healed." This is a direct reference to Isaiah 53, verse 4 and 5. Then from Rabbi Simeon ben Yohai in the 2nd century, in the Zohar, on page 212 and page 218, it says, quote, "There is in the Garden of Eden a palace called the Palace of the Sons of Sickness. This palace the Messiah enters and summons every sickness, every pain, and every chastisement of Israel. They all come and rest upon him. And were it not that he had thus lightened them off Israel and taken them upon himself, there would have been no man able to bear Israel's chastisement for the transgression of the law. This is that which is written, quote, 'Surely our sicknesses he has carried,' which is Isaiah 53:4. As they tell him, the Messiah, of the misery of Israel in their captivity, and of those wicked ones among them who are not attentive to know their Lord, he lifts up his voice and weeps for their wickedness, and so it is written, quote, 'He was wounded for our transgressions,' which is a direct quote from Isaiah 53. So that's in the Zohar. And in Midrash on Ruth 2:14, it says, quote, 'He is speaking of the King Messiah. Come hither,' i.e., draw near to the throne and eat of the bread, is reference to the bread of the kingdom. This refers to the chastisements, as it is said, quote, 'But he,' meaning the Messiah, 'was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities.' Again, direct reference to Isaiah 53. Rabbi Elijah Davidus in the 16th century said, quote, 'The meaning of he was wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities is that since the Messiah bears our iniquities, which produce the effect of his being bruised, it follows that whoever will not admit that Messiah thus suffers for our iniquities must endure and suffer them for himself.'" But yet here we have all the modern rabbis, we have Jews for Judaism even, claiming that, oh no, Judaism never believed Messiah would suffer or die. They never believed Isaiah 53 and all that was about Messiah. No chance that Daniel chapter 9 could be about the Messiah being cut off. There's no chance. That's the lie that they spin. But here we see the direct evidence. Direct evidence. From Sifre, Siphere, quote, Rabbi Jose the Galilean said, "Come and learn the merits of the King Messiah and the reward of the just. From the first man who received but one commandment, a prohibition, and transgressed it. Consider how many deaths were inflicted upon himself, upon his own generation, upon those who followed them, till the end of all generations. Which attribute is greater, the attribute of goodness or the attribute of vengeance?" He answered, "The attribute of goodness is greater, and the attribute of vengeance is the less. How much more then will the King Messiah, who endures affliction and pains for the transgressions, as it is written, he was wounded, etc., justify all generations?" This is the meaning of the word, quote, "And the Lord made the iniquity of all of us to meet upon him," which is a direct reference to Isaiah 53, verse 6. Next we have Rabbi Eliezer Kalir in the 9th century, who wrote the following prayer, quote, "Our righteous Messiah has departed from us. Horror has seized us, and we have no one to justify us. He has borne our transgressions and the yoke of our iniquities, and is wounded because of our transgressions. He bore our sins upon his shoulders, that we may find pardon for our iniquity. We shall be healed by his wounds at the time when the eternal will create him a new creature. O bring him up from the circle of the earth. Raise him up from the air, that we may hear him the second time." Then Rabbi Moses, the preacher from the 11th century, wrote in his commentary on Genesis, which you can see on page 660, quote, "From the beginning God has made a covenant with the Messiah and told him, 'My righteous Messiah, those who are entrusted to you, their sins will bring you into a heavy yoke.' And he answered, the Messiah answered, 'I gladly accept all these agonies, in order that not one of Israel should be lost.' Immediately the Messiah accepted all agonies with love, as it is written, 'He was oppressed and he was afflicted.'" From the Pesachta on Isaiah 61, it says, quote, "Great oppressions were laid upon you," as it says, "By oppression and judgment he was taken away, but considered in his time that he was cut off from the land of the living, that he was stricken because of the sins of our children," which is a direct reference to Isaiah 53:8. As it says, "But the Lord has laid on him the guilt of us all." End quote. Maimonides, again, in a letter to Yemen in the 12th century, wrote, quote, "What is to be the manner of Messiah's advent, and where will be the place of his appearance?" And Isaiah speaks similarly of the time that he will appear without his father or mother or family being known, meaning they won't be famous. He came up as a sucker before him and as a root out of the dry earth. But the unique phenomenon attending his manifestation is that all the kings of the earth will be thrown into terror at the fame of him. Their kingdoms will be in consternation, and they themselves will be devising whether to oppose him with arms or to adopt some different course, confessing in fact their inability to contend with him or ignore his presence, and so confounded at the wonders which they will see him work, that they will lay their hands upon their mouth, in the words of Isaiah, when describing the manner in which the kings will hearken to him. "At him kings will shut their mouth, for that which had not been told them they have seen, and that which they had not heard they have perceived." While on that note, I'm going to read from Qumran Scroll 4Q521. This ancient text, written hundreds of years before Jesus, showing ancient Jewish beliefs, says the following. And because I'm mentioning this now because it testifies that Messiah would do specific miracles of healing, but modern Judaism denies that Messiah is supposed to even do anything like that. But this goes in hand with what I just read by Maimonides, where it says that the pagans of the earth will be confounded at the wonders which they will see the Messiah work. So here we see in Qumran Scroll 4Q521, and by the way, scholars now agree that it probably was not the Essenes who wrote the scrolls. It was the Essenes who protected the scrolls, because the Essenes were some of the strictest of the sects of Judaism back then, and they were really scripturally based, and they really trusted in many scriptures which we may not even have access to anymore because of the sands of time. But nonetheless, anyways, whoever wrote them, it says here, "The heavens and the earth will listen to his Messiah, and none therein will stray from the commandments of the holy ones. Seekers of the Lord, strengthen yourselves in his service. All you hopeful in your heart, will you not find the Lord in this? For the Lord will conquer the pious and call the righteous by name. Over the poor his spirit will hover, and he will renew the faithful with his power. Now, I'll just interject and sidetrack here. In the New Testament, most Christians don't even know this. There's only a few times Jesus healed people and it's spoken about, like detailed. When he healed in one of the instances, which is repeated throughout the New Testament, when he healed this man who was lame from birth, he gave him a very stern warning afterwards. He said, if you sin again, your condition will be worse than before. This shows a connection between suffering and sin and all that. I'm not getting into a whole discourse here. But it wasn't just that Jesus went around magically healing people for fun or because they didn't deserve it. It was people who were deserving and who wanted it and had the faith that God was real and could do it, and that God would love them and forgive them. But they also had to be ready on the inside. Jesus would ask the people, do you want me to heal you? And he would ask them, do you believe? Right? One time a lady grabbed his cloak and she was healed. And he said, I didn't actually heal you. Your belief healed yourself. Right? So, but anyways, right? I'm sidetracking again. But when it said here, we'll renew the faithful with his power, that's what I mean. He will just go to random people and just heal them for no reason. Because suffering, justice, and sin are all related. Okay? They all work together in their own science. So anyways, it says, over the poor his spirit will hover and will renew the faithful with his power, and he will glorify the pious on the throne of the eternal kingdom. He who liberates the captives, restores sight to the blind, straightens the bent, and forever will cleave to the hopeful and in his mercy, and the fruit will not be delayed for anyone. And the Lord will accomplish glorious things which have never been as he, and there's missing text. For he will heal the wounded and revive the dead and bring good news to the poor. He will lead the uprooted in knowledge, and the rest of the text is gone. So it says that the Lord will accomplish glorious things that have never been in a missing text. It must obviously say he will do things that people had never seen before. Because the next line is, he will heal the wounded, revive the dead, and bring good news to the poor. This was written hundreds of years before Jesus. This obviously shows that not only did the Jews who wrote this believe such, but there was a collective who did back then. How widespread was it? Can any of us really prove? But how do you really think Jesus had access to this Dead Sea Scroll back in his day? Obviously not. This shows that it was a widespread belief. Because otherwise if Jesus really did invent this crazy imaginary religion of his own, why would he have tailored it in such a style? He never had access to that Qumran scroll. He didn't. They were buried there hundreds of years BC, and they weren't touched again. If that was a cult belief, like Judaism says, or the crazy Essenes, they were ascetics living in the wilderness, and who knows what they did out there. They had all these crazy ideas. Like, this is what they always portray, but clearly this was a widespread belief, right? So anyways, that's that. But getting back to what Maimonides said. So he said, in a similar way, it says that the kingdom of the world will be in consternation, I'd say, confessing, in fact, their inability to contend with him or ignore his presence, and so confounded at the wonders which they will see him work, that they will lay their hands upon their mouth, in the words of Isaiah. Okay? Next, Rabbi Moses Maimonides said, what is the manner of Messiah's advent? There shall rise up one of whom none have known before, and signs and wonders which they shall see performed by him will be the proofs of his true origin. For the Almighty, where he declares to us his mind upon this matter, says, quote, behold, a man whose name is the branch, and he shall branch forth out of his place, which is reference to Zechariah 6:12. Isaiah speaks similarly of the time when he shall appear without father or mother or family being known. He came up as a sucker before him and as a root out of the dry earth. In the words of Isaiah, when describing the manner in which kings will hearken to him, at him kings will shut their mouth, for that which had not been told them they have seen, that which they had not heard they have perceived. Next, Aramaic translation of Isaiah 53 ascribed to Rabbi Jonathan ben Uziel, a disciple of Hillel, one of the most famous rabbis of history. says, beginning with the simple and worthy words, quote, "Behold, my servant Messiah shall prosper. He shall be high and increase, and be exceedingly strong, as the house of Israel looked to him through many days, because their countenance was darkened among the peoples, and their complexion beyond the sons of men." Which is a reference to Targum Jonathan and Isaiah 53. Then also in the Talmud, Sanhedrin 98b, which I may have already read, the Messiah, what is his name? The rabbis say the leprous one. Those of the house of the rabbis say the sick one, as it is said, surely he has borne our sicknesses, which is Isaiah 53 referenced. In the mysteries of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, in the Midrash we find, he says, quote, "An Armalas will join battle with Messiah the son of Ephraim in the east gate. The Messiah of Ephraim will die there, and Israel will mourn for him." And later on he says, "So they will despise him, as it is written, despised and forlorn of men. But he will turn and hide himself from them, according to the words, like one hiding his face from us." So, I mean, even though he's got his own, vision of the apocalypse and how things might go, apocalyptic vision with his own twist on things, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I'm just saying, he's got his own twist on things. He still points out a belief that the Messiah would die, okay? But that he would be returning again, okay? Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman in the 13th century said, quote, "The right view respecting this parasha is to suppose that by the phrase, 'my servant,' the whole of Israel is meant." That's what Judaism says nowadays. As a different opinion, however, he says, is adopted by the Midrash, which refers it to the Messiah, it is necessary for us to explain it in conformity with the view there maintained. The prophet says the Messiah, the son of David, of whom the text speaks, will never be conquered or perish by the hands of his enemies, and in fact the text teaches this clearly. So what Nachmanides is actually saying there is that, some people might say that Israel is the my servant, but it's actually about Messiah. And contrary to what people might believe, the wrongly informed people, Nachmanides says, yeah, the Messiah would suffer and die at the hands of his enemies. Okay? And he continues, he says, "And by his stripes we are healed, because the stripes by which he is vexed and distressed will heal us. God will pardon us for his righteousness, and we shall be healed both from our own transgressions and from the iniquities of our fathers." And I just want to add in some theodicy here, because it's not that God is doing any of this as some carnal, bizarre, heathen sacrifice. Like, I hurt this guy and you're magically better. There's deeper reasons to things. It's just at the surface level we observe that Messiah suffered and died. It doesn't mean that it was a mechanical, carnal act or like a sacrifice. That's the surface level, what we observe happening, and that we in our narrow minds as human beings concoct short form, trying to understand the cosmic reasons for things, when the cosmic reasons for things might be much greater. I don't believe for a second that it's because of some mechanical, carnal act, right? Like some sacrifice. No. There's a logical underlying reason for it that makes perfect logical sense. In the Midrash Tanhuma, Parasha Toldot, it says, quote, "Who art thou, O great mountain?" from Zechariah 4:7. This refers to the King Messiah. And why does he call him the great mountain? Because he is greater than the patriarchs, as it is said, quote, "My servant shall be high and lifted up and lofty exceedingly. He shall be higher than Abraham, who said, I raised my hand unto the Lord. Lifted up above Moses, of whom it is said, lifted up into thy bosom. Loftier than the ministering angels, of whom it is written, their wheels were lofty and terrible. And out of whom does he come forth? Out of David." So loftier than the ministering angels. This is a Christian view, because Christians, I'm not saying this is a Christian view. That is a Jewish view, but it aligns with the Christian view, which is that Jesus is above all the angels. Like, that's just the status or the office that God has given to him, or that he always had from his own creation or beginning with God. Non-Trinitarian, of course, right? But anyways, and he is the seed of David. He is the seed of man, Jesus. Virgin birth is a myth. And the New Testament says that he is the son of Joseph. It lists off his genealogies, which would be irrelevant if he was virgin born, because you cannot legally, according to Tanakh, acquire tribal status through your mother or father. You have to, what is it? Sorry, you have to acquire tribal status through your mother or father. You cannot, it has to come through the father actually. You can't be adopted and get the tribal status. It doesn't work. Um, so, anyways, right? But anyways, in the Alpha, it says from the 13th century, "Who art thou, O great mountain?" This did I just read that one? Oh, no, it's similar to the last one. It just says the same thing, and loftier than the ministering angels. From the Alcut as well, it says in regard to Psalm 2:6, "I have drawn him out of the chastisements." The chastisements are divided into three parts: one for David and the fathers, one for our own generation, and one for the King Messiah. And this is that which is written, quote, "He was wounded for our transgressions," unquote. Rabbi Elijah Davidus, 16th century, wrote, "Since the Messiah bears our iniquities, which produce the effect of his being bruised, it follows that," oh, I already read this one. "It follows that whoso will not admit that the Messiah thus suffers for our iniquities must endure and suffer them for himself." Rabbi Moshe Cohen Ibn Crispin, a 15th century rabbi, says, "This passage, Isaiah 53, the commentators explain, speaks of the captivity of Israel, although the singular number is used in it throughout. Others have supposed it to mean the just in the present world, the righteous remnant, who are crushed and oppressed now. But these options, too, for the same reason, by altering the number, distort the verses from their natural meaning. And then it seemed to me that, having forsaken the knowledge of our teachers, and inclined after the stubbornness of our own hearts, and by ours, their own opinion, I'm pleased to interpret it that, in accordance with the teaching of our rabbis, it is of the King Messiah." So even though people were stubborn, they went by what they thought should be, and they said, "Oh, it's Israel." Nope, he says, "I am pleased to interpret it in accordance with the teachings of our rabbis, that it is of the King Messiah." So what does that tell you? That tells you that the widespread consensus in Judaism at the time was that it was about Messiah, in that, ironically, the ones who were a little splinter group, the opposers, were the ones saying, "Oh, no, it's not Messiah." They were the little splinter group. Okay? This is like the second or third affirmation that shows that it was widely established. He also goes on to say that this prophecy was delivered by Isaiah at the divine command for the purpose of making known to us something about the nature of the future Messiah, who is to come and deliver Israel, and his life from the day when he arrives at discretion until his advent as a Redeemer, in order that if anyone should arise claiming to be himself the Messiah, we may reflect and look to see whether we can observe in him any resemblance to the traits described here, meaning in Isaiah 53. If there is any such resemblance, that we may believe that he is the Messiah, our righteousness, but if not, we cannot do so. And this is literally on the section on the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. Okay? Rabbi Moshe Cohen and Crispin. Rabbi Moshe al-Sheikh, the rabbi of Safed in the late 16th century, said, and this is a powerful one, he says, "I may remark then that our rabbis with one voice accept and affirm the opinion that the prophet Isaiah is speaking of the King Messiah in Isaiah 53. Our rabbis with one voice. That means there's solidarity there. It is the Messiah in those chapters. It was just a little splinter group of naysayers who have now developed into all the anti-missionariness throughout almost the entirety of Judaism, right? That splinter group became the great one, okay? But Rabbi Shlomo Astruk in the 14th century said, "My servant shall prosper, be truly intelligent, because by intelligence man is really man. It is intelligence which makes a man what he is. And the prophet calls the King Messiah my servant, speaking as one who sent him. Or he may call the whole people my servant, as he says, above my people. When he speaks of the people, the King Messiah is included in it. And when he speaks of the King Messiah, the people is comprehended with him. What he says then is that my servant, the King Messiah, will prosper." Much to the point, and that's what I kind of believe as well. I believe that things are interchangeable like that. I believe that it is manifold. I'm not saying, obviously a lot of the uses of the term "my servant" are about Israel, but when the other thing that's important is when you look at the entire book of Isaiah, the term "my servant" occurs 16 times. Out of the 16 times, about 6 of them are unique. Okay, it only applies to Israel a few times. I think like 4 times. It applies in one case. It says Eliakim is called my servant. Another one, David is called my servant. Another one, Jacob is called my servant. Another one, Isaiah is called my servant. Another one, I think, is openly accepted as being about the Messiah in one of the other chapters. And then you have Israel. That's 6 options, 6 different subjects for who my servant is applied to in the chapters of Isaiah. But if you listen to any of the modern rabbis, they say, oh, it's like, they always portray it like it's always Israel. No, like, so you could open up Isaiah, no matter what chapter you look at, oh, bam, my servant, bam, that's Israel. No question, it's Israel. So you get to Isaiah 52 and 53, bam, that's got to be Israel. That's the way they portray it. But in reality, no, you got 6 options throughout all the chapters. You got to see what is said, who it's talking about, who is described, look at the context, the things being said. We can see in Isaiah 53 it cannot be Israel because Israel never got cut off from the land of the living. It says that the one who did get cut off from the land of the living never had deceit in their mouth. But if you look in Psalm 78, we see God specifically say that Israel, and ironic with the words, he says that Israel has deceit in their mouth and they lie to me. So how can you turn around and say in Isaiah 53, oh, it's Israel cut off from the line of the wicked, like when did that happen? And then just say like, oh, but Israel's so nice, and like Judaism is so nice, and we never lied, we're good, honest people. Well, God himself, the author of all this reality, said that, oh no, well, deceit is in your mouth. The exact terms used in Isaiah 53. So I'm sorry, you can't claim that you can't claim that Israel never had deceit in his mouth, right? And it also says in Isaiah 53 that one would never harm like a plant. He would never harm anybody. Israel went throughout all the nations doing what they did. Don't spare any living thing. Don't let any living thing be left breathing. And you're going to tell me that it's Isaiah 53, it's Israel who never lifted a finger against everybody? Never lifted their voice up in the street? Like, I don't believe that, right? But I'm not getting into Isaiah 53, but there's a million reasons why it's not about Israel. The great Jewish educator Herz Homburg from 1749 to 1841 said, according to the opinion of Rashi and Ibn Ezra, it relates to Israel at the end of their captivity. But if so, what can be the meaning of the passage, quote, he was wounded for our transgressions? So, who was wounded? Who are the transgressors? Who carried out the sickness and bore the pain? The fact is, it refers to the King Messiah. And then one of the greatest Jewish religious poets, Eliezer HaKalir, paraphrased this chapter in the 9th century in rhyme and metric poetry. This is recited on the Yom Kippur prayer of Kether. It says, why our righteousness is turned from us. We are in terror. I think I read this one. None to justify us. Our iniquities and the yoke of our transgressions he did bear for us. He is wounded for our transgressions. He carries our sins upon his shoulder, that we may find forgiveness for our iniquities, and by his stripes we are healed. O Eternal One, the time has come to make a new creation from the vault of heaven, bring him up, out of Seir draw him forth, that we may make his voice heard to us, that he may make his voice heard to us in Lebanon, a second time by the hand of Yinon. And then here, from the Karaite, Yafeth ben Ali in the 10th century, it says, as to myself I am inclined, with Benjamin of Nehawend, to regard Isaiah 53 as alluding to the Messiah, and as opening with a description of his condition in exile from the time of his birth to the accession to the throne. The prophet, and he had a heavenly throne, by the way, for the prophet begins by speaking of his being seated in a position of great honor, and then goes back to relate all that will happen to him during the captivity. He thus gives to us understanding 2 things. In the first instance, that the Messiah will only reach his high degree of honor after long wait and severe trials. And secondly, that these trials will be sent upon him as a kind of a sign, so that if he finds himself under the yoke of misfortunes whilst remaining pure in his actions, he may know that he is the desired one. By the words, quote, surely he has carried our sicknesses, end quote, they mean that the pains and sicknesses from which he fell into are merited by them, but that he bore them instead. And here I think it necessary to pause for a few moments in order to explain why God caused these sicknesses to attach themselves to the Messiah for the sake of Israel. The nation deserved from God greater punishment than that which actually came upon them, but not being strong enough to bear it, God appointed his servant to carry their sins, and by doing so lighten their punishment in order that Israel might not be completely exterminated. End quote. And the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. End quote. The prophet does not by avon mean iniquity, but punishment for iniquity, as in the passage, quote, be sure your sin will find you out. end quote, which is a reference to Numbers 32:23. And then finally, from the Lekach in the 11th century, Midrash, it says, quote, and let Israel's kingdom be exalted, end quote, in the days of the Messiah, of whom it is said, behold, my servant shall prosper, he will be high and exalted and lofty exceedingly. It's a direct reference to Isaiah 53. So all throughout these ages here, all the way up to 1600s, we see Judaism and even widespread belief that these chapters are about Messiah. So what is the conclusion here? And again, this is a sample of all the evidence that's out there. Okay, this is just some of it. It's not even all of it. It's not even close to all of it. Um, so it's just a flat out lie to say that Judaism, the rabbis, the people, they never believed these things about Messiah. Okay, it's a simple fact that Judaism, the people, and the rabbis did believe Messiah would come twice. That he would die in the first one, he would suffer and die the first time, but then come back to great glory at the end of the days. Okay, this is simply the case, and we've seen lots of evidence for it. Like I said, there's more evidence out there. So anybody, any rabbi, Tovia Singer, I don't care who, anybody out there to say that, oh no, it's not true, it's just a crazy Christian conspiracy and idea, that's just a lie. Okay, and maybe they're not willingly lying. Maybe it's just because they haven't done all the study and educated themselves to the required level. I don't know. But it's either that or they're lying. They're doing it on purpose or they're not doing it on purpose. But it's simply not true what they're claiming. Okay? Things did change. The little splinter group that were the naysayers rose to more power whenever it was, year 1000, year 1500. But the splinter group emerged. It's probably related, not genetically, but I'm saying probably related to the splinter group that opposed Jesus. Thousands of Jews came to Jesus. They stayed as Jews because Jesus taught Matthew 5:17. If you're Jewish, you got to keep the law. But anyways, right? Thousands of Jews in Jesus' day came to Jesus, but we all know that there were those who opposed him. Okay? I mean, they opposed him and wanted him put to death simply for healing a man, the guy I spoke about earlier, on the Sabbath. Right? They wanted to stone him just for doing that, and because Jesus told the guy to pick up his mat. And I'll mention this because it popped into my head again, right? The reason why, and Jesus did say this, but he said it's actually not against the law to heal on the Sabbath. He says that circumcision is performed lawfully on the Sabbath. That's what he said. And he said that's making somebody whole again, repairing the breaches. And he says, I made somebody whole. How can you seek to punish me for doing that? It's not against the law. And that's true. So what he did wasn't against the law. But then some people say, fine, that wasn't against the law, but he told the guy to pick up his mat. I mean, this is how hard you're going after somebody, to corner them and bring them down. Don't you see how bitter that is? But anyways, right? So they go after him for telling the guy to pick up his mat. But this guy had been, lame and sick and this and that there. He had been out there in public, wherever it was that he was, probably by a temple or something, with his dirty mat, sitting on it, stinking and whatever, not doing anything, bumming for money. Jesus merely told him probably what was only law. Pick up the mess from behind you, take it and leave. Why should he tell the guy, get up and litter and just leave his dirty mat there? His dirty mat, which may be qualified as unclean. You know what I mean? He was healed. If a priest inspected the guy, he was healed and whole. I can't remember what his injury was or what his problem was. He wasn't able to walk. Could have been anything. Could have been disease. But, there you go. But, anyways. So, I think this is great evidence. I don't want it to be too much longer. There you go, folks. That's the proof for you. Okay, who's right, who's wrong? I didn't make all those quotes up. Ancient Jews said them. Very famous ancient Jews and ancient Jewish texts. I mean, you can't say it's a lie. It's real. So I win this argument. Sorry. Okay, God bless you.